A gardener approached a millionaire and told her not to travel with her husband. The next morning, there was a luxury car parked next to her humble house. The grand chandelier in the Bennett mansion sparkled like a constellation, casting a warm glow over the crowd of impeccably dressed guests. Valerie Montgomery Bennett, draped in a flowing emerald green gown that highlighted her graceful figure, moved effortlessly through the room. Her smile, as radiant as the diamonds around her neck, was practiced, perfect even. Guests greeted her with admiration, their voices full of praise for her elegance and charm. To everyone present, Valerie and Arthur Bennett were the epitome of a successful couple. Arthur, a powerful businessman with a commanding presence, stood by her side, his tailored suit accentuating his broad shoulders. Together, they were a vision of success, wealth, and influence. The Bennetts were not just admired, they were envied. But behind Valerie's poised exterior, something gnawed at her. Lately, she had begun to feel a subtle but persistent unease, a nagging sensation that the foundation of her seemingly perfect life might not be as solid as it appeared. As the evening progressed, Arthur's laughter echoed across the room. He was captivating, charismatic, and entirely in his element, entertaining a group of influential guests. Valerie stood a few steps away, holding a glass of champagne, her eyes scanning the room. She often caught herself observing him, searching for something. She couldn't name it, but there were moments when his smile felt hollow, his charm calculated. "You must be so proud of Arthur," said a woman to Valerie, her tone dripping with admiration. "He's achieved so much." Valerie responded with a polite nod and a practiced smile. "Of course," she said, though the words felt automatic. Pride was a complicated emotion for her. Arthur's accomplishments were undeniable, but lately, his successes seemed to come with a cost, one she couldn't quite articulate. Later that evening, after the last guest had left and the staff began tidying up, Valerie retired to her bedroom. She slipped off her heels and let out a soft sigh, leaning against the edge of the bed. The lavish room, with its high ceilings and gold-accented furniture, felt more like a museum than a sanctuary. The stillness was deafening. Arthur entered moments later, his tie loosened and a glass of whiskey in hand. He approached Valerie, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Another successful evening," he said, his voice smooth. Our guests were thoroughly impressed. Valerie forced a smile. "You were wonderful, as always." Arthur leaned down, brushing a kiss against her cheek. "Get some rest tomorrow. I'll need you by my side for the meeting in Chicago." She nodded. Though her mind wandered, the trip to Chicago was meant to finalize a lucrative business deal, but she couldn't shake the discomfort she felt. Arthur's insistence that she accompany him was unusually forceful, and it left her questioning his motives. The next morning, Valerie stepped out into the sprawling gardens of their Greenwich estate. The air was crisp, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the floral aroma of the meticulously maintained flower beds. She often sought solace in these gardens, where she could escape the weight of her social obligations. As she strolled along a cobblestone path, she noticed Michael, the gardener, tending to a bed of roses. Michael was in his early 30s, with a quiet demeanor and a hard-working spirit. He had worked for the Bennetts for years, always keeping to himself. This morning, however, he seemed different, tense, almost anxious. When he saw Valerie, he hesitated before approaching her. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, his voice low and hesitant. Valerie tilted her head, curious. "Yes, Michael." He glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "I need to tell you something. It's important." Her brow furrowed. "What is it?" Michael took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "Please, don't travel with your husband tomorrow, just trust me on this." Valerie blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about?" "I can't explain everything right now," he said urgently, his voice barely above a whisper. "But something's not right. You need to trust me." She studied him, searching for any sign of deception. But all she saw was genuine concern and fear. "Michael, if there's something I need to know, you have to tell me." "I will," he promised. "Just don't go with him tomorrow, please." Valerie nodded slowly, unsure of what to make of the situation. As Michael returned to his work, she couldn't shake the unease his warning had planted in her. That evening, as she and Arthur sat down for dinner, he brought up the trip again. "It's important you come with me," he said, his tone firm. Valerie hesitated before responding. I'm feeling a bit under the weather. Perhaps I should stay behind. Arthur's gaze narrowed slightly, but he nodded. If you're certain, he said, his tone laced with subtle disappointment. As the night wore on, Valerie found herself lying awake, Michael's words echoing in her mind. Trust me, he had said. She wasn't sure if she could, but she also wasn't sure if she could trust Arthur. Valerie woke up to a dim, overcast sky casting long shadows across her bedroom. The usual peace of her mornings felt absent, replaced by the lingering unease from the previous night. She replayed Michael's words over and over. Don't travel with your husband tomorrow. Please. Trust me. She tried to brush it off as she got ready for the day, convincing herself it was paranoia. But the sincerity in Michael's voice had pierced through her, leaving her questioning everything. What could a gardener possibly know that would warrant such a warning? Downstairs, she found Arthur in the dining room, reading the Wall Street Journal as he sipped his coffee. His face was calm, composed, as if nothing in the world could rattle him. Good morning, he said, glancing up briefly before returning to his paper. Good morning, Valerie replied, sitting down across from him. As she stirred her tea, her gaze wandered to Arthur's hands. They were steady, confident, the hands of a man in control. But now, every gesture seemed calculated, every word laced with hidden meaning. I've been thinking, Arthur said suddenly, folding the newspaper neatly and setting it aside, about Chicago. I really believe it would be beneficial for you to come along. The clients appreciate your presence, and it always leaves a strong impression. Valerie looked up from her tea, her heart racing. She could hear the urgency behind his polite words. I'm not sure I'm feeling up to it, she said carefully. I've been a bit tired lately. Arthur tilted his head, studying her. Tired? You seemed perfectly fine last night. It's probably just the stress from all the social events, she replied with a small smile. I think a day of rest would do me good. He didn't respond immediately, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed his thoughts. Of course, he said finally, though his tone was cool. Your health comes first. The conversation ended there, but Valerie could feel the tension thickening between them. Later that morning, Valerie decided to seek out Michael. She found him near the greenhouse, carefully pruning a row of hydrangeas. He looked up when he saw her approaching, his face tense. Michael, she began softly, I need you to explain yourself. Why did you warn me about the trip? What's going on? He hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Mrs. Bennett, I can't tell you everything yet. It's not safe for either of us. Valerie frowned. You've already said that much, but if I'm going to trust you, I need to know what's at stake. Michael put down his pruning shears, running a hand through his dark hair. I overheard a conversation, he admitted, between Mr. Bennett and another man. They were discussing plans. Something about you. It sounded serious, dangerous. What kind of plans? They didn't say everything outright, he said, his voice low. But from what I heard, the trip to Chicago isn't just about business. They were talking about using it as an opportunity to... He paused, struggling with the words. To get rid of you. Valerie's breath caught in her throat. That's ridiculous. Arthur would never... Please, Michael interrupted, his voice pleading. I know how it sounds, but I wouldn't be telling you this if I weren't sure. Something isn't right, and I didn't want to stay silent. Valerie stared at him, her mind reeling. Could it really be true? The man she had trusted, the man she had built her life with, plotting against her. You need to be careful, Michael continued. If he finds out I've spoken to you, he won't hesitate to silence me. Michael, Valerie began, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. He shook his head. Just promise me you'll stay here. Don't let him convince you otherwise. That night, Valerie sat alone in her study, the fireplace crackling softly. In her lap was the ledger Arthur had given her months ago to review, just another piece of his empire, full of numbers and transactions she had never paid much attention to. But tonight, something felt different. Michael's warning had planted a seed of doubt, and for the first time, Valerie felt compelled to look deeper. She flipped through the pages, searching for anything unusual, and then she saw it. a series of transfers labeled as miscellaneous expenses. The amounts were staggering, far beyond what seemed reasonable. She traced the transactions back to a company name she didn't recognize. A quick search on her phone revealed that the company didn't exist. It was a shell corporation. Her stomach turned. Was this proof of Arthur's deceit? As she sat there, her mind racing, she heard footsteps approaching. She quickly closed the ledger and slipped it back into its place just as Arthur entered the room. "You're up late," he said, his tone casual. "I couldn't sleep," Valerie replied, forcing a smile. Arthur walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I hope you'll reconsider coming to Chicago," he said. "It would mean a lot to me." "I'll think about it," she lied. Arthur smiled, but his eyes held a flicker of something darker, something she couldn't ignore. The morning sun streamed through the grand windows of the Bennett mansion, casting warm golden light across the marble floors. Valerie sat at the long dining table, her breakfast untouched. The steaming cup of coffee in front of her remained uninviting, its aroma unable to break through the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Arthur entered the room with his usual composed demeanor, his leather briefcase in hand and a freshly pressed suit, accentuating his commanding presence. He leaned down to kiss her cheek, but Valerie stiffened ever so slightly, a movement he seemed not to notice. "Good morning, darling," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," she replied softly. Her voice strained. He sat across from her, casually flipping through his phone. "I've finalized the itinerary for Chicago," he began, his tone conversational but deliberate. "Our flight leaves tomorrow at noon. I've arranged for dinner with the investors at the Gold Leaf. It's important they see how strong we are as a team." Valerie hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Michael's warning echoed in her mind. "Don't let him convince you." "I've been thinking," she said, keeping her tone light. "Perhaps it's better if I stay behind this time." Arthur looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing. "Stay behind? Why would you do that?" "I haven't been feeling well," Valerie said, offering a faint smile. "I think I need a few days to rest." Arthur's jaw tightened, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "You seemed perfectly fine yesterday." "It's probably just the stress catching up with me," she said, avoiding his gaze. Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. "Valerie, this trip is important. Not just for the business, but for us. The investors need to see us as a united front. They trust us because they see strength in our partnership." His words carried weight, but they also felt rehearsed, as if he had anticipated her resistance. Valerie took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I understand that, Arthur, but I think this time you'll do just fine on your own." For a moment, the room was silent except for the soft clinking of Arthur's spoon against his coffee cup. Finally, he set it down and smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course," he said smoothly. "If you truly feel you need to rest, I won't push you." His tone was agreeable, but Valerie could sense the tension beneath it. He wasn't pleased, and that realization sent a chill down her spine. Later that day, Valerie found herself wandering the estate's gardens again, seeking solace in the quiet beauty of the flowers and fountains. But even here, the weight of her thoughts followed her. As she walked along the cobblestone path, she spotted Michael trimming the hedges. His movements were precise, his expression focused, but when he noticed her approaching, he straightened up. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted, his voice low. "Michael," Valerie began, glancing around to ensure no one else was nearby. "I told Arthur I'm not going to Chicago." Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "That's good," he said. "You made the right choice, but I need more than your word to go on," she pressed. "If I'm going to protect myself, and you, I need to know exactly what I'm up against." Michael hesitated, his hands tightening around the hedge clippers. "I told you. I overheard something. It was enough to know that you were in danger." "Was it about me specifically?" Valerie asked, her voice firm. "Or just business?" Michael looked away, his jaw tightening. "It was about you," he admitted. "Mr. Bennett said something about making sure you wouldn't. 'Cause problems. And the other man mentioned the trip as an opportunity to clean up loose ends." Valerie's breath caught. The words felt like ice against her skin. "You're sure of what you heard?" "Yes," Michael said, meeting her gaze. and I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't. That evening, Valerie sat in her study, flipping through Arthur's ledgers again. Her heart raced as she examined the numbers, her eyes scanning for inconsistencies. The shell company she had discovered earlier was only the tip of the iceberg. Page after page revealed transactions that didn't add up. Large sums of money funneled through unknown entities. All under vague descriptions, it was a trail of breadcrumbs, and she was beginning to see where it led. As she worked, the door to the study creaked open. Valerie looked up sharply, her heart skipping a beat. Arthur stood in the doorway, his expression calm but his eyes watchful. "Working late, I see," he said. Stepping inside, "I was just reviewing some of the accounts," she replied, closing the ledger casually, "making sure everything is in order." Arthur smiled, but there was an edge to it. "That's my wife, always so diligent." He walked over, his presence filling the room, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you do for us," he said, his voice smooth. Valerie nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you." Arthur lingered for a moment before stepping back. "Get some rest," he said. "We've got a big day tomorrow." As he left the room, Valerie exhaled shakily. She glanced down at the ledger, her mind racing. She was running out of time, and she knew it. The next morning was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Valerie sat by the large bay window in the sitting room, watching as the sunlight poured over the manicured lawn. Despite the beauty of the morning, her chest felt heavy, her thoughts clouded by the discoveries she'd made. Arthur had left early, mentioning last-minute preparations for the Chicago trip. His absence offered Valerie a brief sense of relief, but it was accompanied by an even greater urgency to act. She reached for her phone, dialing the number of her closest confidant, Emily Roth, a lawyer and one of the few people Valerie trusted. As the line rang, Valerie rehearsed what she would say, carefully avoiding the more dangerous truths she couldn't yet prove. "Valerie," Emily's warm voice greeted on the other end. "What a surprise. How are you?" "I've been better," Valerie admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Emily, I need your advice on something." "Delicate. Of course, is everything all right?" "Not exactly. I've come across some irregularities in Arthur's accounts," Valerie began, choosing her words carefully. "It might be nothing, but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." "Send me what you've found," Emily said immediately. "I'll take a look." "Thank you. I'll send it over as soon as I can." As Valerie ended the call, she felt a flicker of hope. Emily's expertise might help her uncover the truth, but she knew time wasn't on her side. That afternoon, Valerie decided to visit the guest house on the far edge of the property. Where Michael lived, she needed to talk to him again, to piece together more of the puzzle. As she approached, she noticed a sleek black car parked outside, a model she recognized instantly as one of Arthur's favorites. Her heart skipped a beat. What was it doing here? Valerie ducked behind a hedge, her pulse quickening. The car's engine was off, but the vehicle's imposing presence seemed to radiate a warning. Slowly, she crept closer, her heels silent on the soft grass. When she reached the driver's side, she peered through the tinted window. The interior was spotless, as expected, but it was the manila folder on the passenger seat that caught her eye. Unable to resist, Valerie glanced around to ensure no one was watching before carefully opening the unlocked door. Her hands trembled as she picked up the folder, her breath catching when she saw the contents. Inside were contracts, bank statements, and handwritten notes, all tied to the same shell corporation she had seen in Arthur's ledgers. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but one document stood out. A detailed itinerary for the Chicago trip. Highlighted in bold red letters were the words, Stage 3, Incident Execution. Valerie's blood ran cold. She couldn't fully understand what the phrase meant, but it confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't just about shady business deals. It was about her. The sound of a door creaking open snapped Valerie back to reality. She quickly slid the folder back onto the seat and shut the car door, retreating behind the hedge just as Michael stepped out of the guest house. He froze when he saw the car, his expression darkening. Valerie emerged from her hiding spot, her face pale but determined. "Michael," she said urgently, "what's that car doing here?" Michael's eyes darted to the vehicle, then back to her. "I don't know. It was here when I came out." Valerie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I looked inside. There are documents, proof that Arthur is involved in something criminal, and I think he's planning to use this trip to get rid of me." Michael's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have done that if he finds out." "Then help me," Valerie interrupted. "I can't do this alone." Michael hesitated, clearly torn. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we have to be smart about this. If Arthur finds out we're onto him, he won't hesitate to act." That evening, Valerie locked herself in her bedroom, her mind racing. The documents she'd seen haunted her, each piece of evidence solidifying the grim reality she was facing. She opened her laptop, uploading the scans she'd made of Arthur's ledgers and emailing them to Emily. In her message, she kept her tone cautious, but the urgency was clear. Moments after hitting send, her phone buzzed. It was Emily. "Valerie, these documents?" Emily's voice was sharp. "If they're legitimate, this is serious. Fraud, money laundering, possibly worse. Are you sure about the source?" "Yes," Valerie said firmly. "I need you to look into the Shell Corporation. I think it's the key to everything." "I'll get started right away," Emily assured her. "But you need to be careful if what you're saying is true. Arthur might go to great lengths to protect himself." "I know," Valerie whispered, glancing toward the closed door. As night fell, Valerie stood by her window, gazing out at the shadowy estate. Somewhere out there, Arthur was preparing for his flight, likely unaware of how much she already knew. Her fingers traced the edges of the itinerary she'd managed to photograph from the folder. Stage 3, Incident Execution, loomed large in her mind, a grim reminder of what she was up against. She had no choice now. The life she had built was crumbling, but she would not go down without a fight. The next morning, the estate felt eerily still. Valerie woke up with a sense of purpose, but also a growing dread. She knew she couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. The documents she had seen, the ominous itinerary, and Michael's warning all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Arthur was hiding something sinister, and she was at the center of it. After breakfast, Valerie found Michael near the greenhouse, carefully watering a row of blooming orchids. His posture was stiff, his movements less fluid than usual, as though the weight of the previous day still lingered. "Michael," Valerie called softly as she approached. He turned to her, his expression cautious. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted, glancing around as if ensuring they were alone. "I need answers," Valerie said firmly, her voice low but resolute. "No more half-truths. I saw the documents in that car yesterday. Arthur is planning something, and it involves me. You know more than you've told me." Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. But then he sighed, setting down the watering can. "You're right," he admitted. "You deserve the full truth, but you have to promise me you'll be careful. Tell me everything," Valerie pressed, her heart pounding. Michael leaned against the edge of the greenhouse, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I overheard a conversation between Mr. Bennett and one of his associates a few weeks ago. They were talking about a problem that needed to be dealt with. At first, I didn't think much of it. Business talk, you know." Valerie nodded, urging him to continue. "But then," Michael said, his voice growing darker, "they mentioned your name. They said you were getting too curious, that you might start asking questions about things you weren't supposed to know." Valerie's stomach churned. "And the trip to Chicago," Michael exhaled sharply. "They called it the perfect opportunity. They didn't say exactly what they were planning, but the way they talked about it, it sounded final." "Final," Valerie echoed, the word cutting through her like a blade. Michael looked up, his eyes filled with urgency. "That's why I warned you. I couldn't stand by and let it happen. I know what kind of man Arthur is, what he's capable of." Valerie stepped back, the weight of his words threatening to crush her. She had suspected, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. They walked toward the edge of the gardens, where the towering oaks provided a semblance of privacy. Valerie needed a moment to process everything, but the gravity of the situation left no room for hesitation. "Michael," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, "you're risking everything to help me." "Why?" He hesitated, glancing at her before answering. "Because I owe you more than you know, and because I've seen too many people get hurt by men like Arthur." "What do you mean?" Michael paused. his hands clenching at his sides. "Years ago, when I was a kid, my mother worked for your family. She was one of the housekeepers. Do you remember her, Claire?" Valerie frowned, the name tugging at a distant memory. "Claire. Yes, I remember. She was kind, always humming while she worked." Michael nodded, a faint smile flickering across his face. "She loved working for your family. Until the day she was accused of stealing, someone planted jewelry in her room, and she was fired on the spot. No one believed her when she said she was innocent." Valerie's eyes widened. "I had no idea. I was just a kid," Michael continued, his voice tight with emotion. "But I remember how devastated she was. She passed away a few years later, and I promised myself I'd find a way to make things right." Valerie felt a pang of guilt. "Michael, if I had known—" "I'm not blaming you," he interrupted gently. "You were just a child then. But when I saw the kind of person you grew up to be, I knew I could trust you. That's why I took this job in the first place, to make sure your family's legacy wasn't tarnished by people like Arthur." The revelation left Valerie reeling. Michael's connection to her past added another layer of complexity to the situation, but it also strengthened her resolve. "We need a plan," she said, her voice firm. "Arthur is leaving for Chicago this afternoon, but I can't just sit here and wait for him to make his next move." Michael nodded. "The first step is gathering more evidence. What you found in that car is a start, but it's not enough to take him down. We need something undeniable, something that ties him directly to his crimes." "And how do we get that?" Valerie asked. Michael hesitated, his expression grim. "There's a safe in his study. I've seen him use it. Whatever's in there, it's important enough for him to keep hidden." Valerie's breath caught. Arthur's study was one of the most secure places in the house, but if the safe contained the evidence they needed, she couldn't afford to ignore it. "I'll figure out a way to get in," she said, determination hardening her voice. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "Be careful, Mrs. Bennett. Arthur is dangerous, and if he catches on—" "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I can't let him get away with this. Not anymore." As the sun began to set, Valerie returned to the mansion, her mind racing with possibilities. The house felt heavier than usual, its walls seemingly pressing in on her as if aware of the secrets they contained. She stood outside Arthur's study, staring at the door. Whatever lay beyond it held the key to everything: answers, justice, and perhaps even freedom. Taking a deep breath, Valerie resolved to act. The door to Arthur's study loomed ahead of Valerie like a silent sentinel. She hesitated in the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to do. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was dangerous, that one misstep could unravel everything. Yet, the alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable. She reached for the doorknob, only to freeze as a distant sound echoed through the house. It was faint, perhaps just a creak from the old wood floors, or a gust of wind rattling a window. Still, it was enough to make her pulse quicken. She waited, her breath held, until silence returned. With trembling fingers, Valerie turned the knob and stepped inside. Arthur's study was as imposing as the man himself. Dark oak shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books that seemed more for show than for reading. A massive desk sat at the center, its polished surface gleaming under the light of a brass lamp. The air smelled faintly of cigars and cologne, a reminder of Arthur's omnipresent influence. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for the safe Michael had mentioned. It wasn't visible at first glance, but she knew Arthur wouldn't leave something so important out in the open. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. Valerie's search led her to a painting hanging above the fireplace. A classic cliché, but it made sense. She reached out, carefully lifting the ornate frame, and there it was, a sleek, modern safe embedded in the wall. She exhaled sharply, relief and anxiety flooding her simultaneously. The next challenge was obvious: how to open it. Valerie knelt before the safe, examining the keypad. It required a numerical code, one she had no way of knowing. "Think, Valerie," she whispered to herself. Arthur wasn't careless. The code would be something personal yet discreet, something only he would remember. Her mind raced through possibilities: birthdays, anniversaries, business milestones. She hesitated, then tried their wedding anniversary. The keypad beeped softly, but the lock didn't budge. Next, she tried Arthur's birthday. Another failure. She paused, her frustration mounting. Then a thought struck her. Arthur often boasted about the day he signed his first major business deal, claiming it was the beginning of his empire. She entered the date, 0926. A click. The safe door popped open, revealing a small collection of files, a black leather-bound journal, and several USB drives. Valerie's hands trembled as she pulled out the contents, quickly scanning through the files. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The documents detailed a web of illegal activities, offshore accounts, fraudulent transactions, and payments to shadowy figures labeled as consultants. One file in particular caught her eye. It was labeled Stage 3, Bennett Holdings Contingency. Her stomach churned as she flipped through the pages. The contingency plan was explicit, outlining steps to secure Arthur's empire in the event of a domestic disruption. The chilling part was the emphasis on eliminating unnecessary liabilities. Liabilities like her. Valerie stuffed the files and USB drives into her handbag, her mind spinning. She couldn't stay in the study much longer. Arthur could return at any moment. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of the journal. Something about it called to her. A personal account, perhaps, or further evidence of his crimes. She grabbed the journal and slipped out of the study, closing the door softly behind her. Back in her bedroom, Valerie locked the door and dumped the stolen items onto the bed. She sat down, flipping through the journal's pages. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. Arthur wasn't the type to record his emotions. Instead, it was a collection of notes, meeting summaries and strategies. One entry caught her attention immediately. Michael is becoming a problem. He's been too inquisitive lately. I've instructed Reed to monitor him closely. If he steps out of line, deal with him. Valerie's blood turned to ice. Michael wasn't just at risk for helping her. He was already on Arthur's radar. She picked up her phone, dialing Michael's number with shaky hands. It rang twice before he answered. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice cautious. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're in danger. Arthur knows you've been asking questions." There was a pause on the line. "I figured as much," Michael said grimly. "That's why I've been careful." "No, you don't understand," Valerie pressed. "He's had someone watching you. I found proof in his journal. If he suspects you've helped me." Michael sighed heavily. "It's a risk I was willing to take." Valerie's throat tightened. "I won't let him hurt you, Michael. I owe you that much." The conversation left Valerie more determined than ever. She couldn't afford to wait. The evidence she had gathered needed to reach someone who could act on it. Someone who could bring Arthur down before it was too late. Her thoughts turned to Emily. Valerie reached for her phone again, crafting a message to her friend. "Emily, I have critical evidence against Arthur. I'll explain everything when I see you. Can we meet tomorrow?" Emily's reply came quickly. "Absolutely. I'll clear my schedule, just tell me when and where." Valerie set the phone down, a glimmer of hope piercing through her fear. For the first time, she felt like she had a plan, a way to fight back against the man who had deceived her for so long. But as she prepared for the day ahead, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Arthur wouldn't let her slip away so easily. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the Bennett estate. As Valerie made her way back to the gardens, her conversation with Michael earlier that morning still lingered in her mind, and the journal entry she had found deepened her urgency. Michael wasn't just risking his job. His life was on the line. She found him near the tool shed, wiping dirt off his hands as he finished planting a row of chrysanthemums. He looked up when she approached, his guarded expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, nodding in greeting. "Michael," Valerie replied, her voice quieter than usual. "Do you have a moment to talk?" He hesitated before nodding. "Of course." They walked together toward a shaded corner of the garden, where a small wooden bench sat beneath a canopy of ivy. Valerie sat first, smoothing her skirt as she gathered her thoughts. "I read something in Arthur's journal," she began carefully. "Your name was mentioned. He knows you've been asking questions, Michael. He's had someone watching you." Michael's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I figured as much," he said after a moment. "That's why I've been keeping my head down." "But why risk it at all?" Valerie pressed. Why warn me when you knew it could put you in danger? Michael leaned back against the bench, running a hand through his hair. Because I couldn't stand by and watch you walk into a trap, he said simply. Valerie studied him, her brow furrowed. You've said that before, but there's more to it, isn't there? This isn't just about me. Michael exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his thoughts was too heavy to carry any longer. You're right, he admitted. There is more to it. He paused, glancing at her before continuing. Do you remember my mother, Claire? The name struck a chord, and Valerie's mind flickered back to her childhood. A kind woman with a warm smile who had always seemed to hum a tune while she worked. Yes, Valerie said softly. I remember her. She worked for my family. Didn't she? Michael nodded. She loved working for your family. She used to say that it was the only place she ever felt respected. But then, everything changed. What happened? She was accused of stealing, Michael said, his voice laced with bitterness. A bracelet went missing, and someone planted it in her room. Your father fired her on the spot, and no one believed her when she said she was innocent. Valerie's chest tightened. I had no idea. I was just a child then. But if I had known, Michael shook his head. It wasn't your fault. You were too young to understand what was happening. But for my mother, it was devastating. That job was everything to her. She never tried to come back, Valerie asked, her voice tinged with regret. She wanted to, Michael said quietly, but the humiliation was too much. She died a few years later. Heart failure, the doctors said. But I know it was the stress that killed her. Valerie reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Michael, I'm so sorry. I never knew. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resolve. That's why I came back here, he admitted. Not just for a job, but to keep an eye on things. I didn't want anyone else to suffer the way my mother did. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his story hanging heavy between them. When I saw how Arthur treated people, Michael continued, his voice low, I knew he wasn't like your father. He's worse, manipulative, ruthless, willing to do anything to protect his empire. And yet you stayed, Valerie said, her voice soft. Because of you, Michael said simply. I saw the kind of person you are, the way you treat people, the way you carry yourself. I knew you were different. And when I overheard what Arthur was planning, I couldn't stay silent. Valerie felt a lump rise in her throat. Michael's loyalty wasn't just an act of duty. It was deeply personal. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Michael gave her a faint smile. Don't thank me yet. We still have a lot to do. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden, Valerie's determination solidified. Michael, she said, her voice steady. I'm going to bring Arthur down, but I can't do it without you. You have my help, he replied without hesitation. Whatever it takes. We'll start with the evidence I found in the safe, Valerie continued. Emily is already looking into the financials if we can tie Arthur directly to his crimes. He won't have anywhere to hide. Michael nodded. But we need to be careful. He's already suspicious. And if he catches wind of what we're doing, he won't, Valerie said firmly. We'll be smart about this. That night, Valerie sat in her study, reviewing the stolen documents for the 100th time. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. Something irrefutable that would force Arthur's hand. Her thoughts drifted to Michael's story, and she felt a renewed sense of guilt for the injustices her family had unknowingly allowed. But guilt wouldn't solve anything. Action would. As the clock ticked past midnight, Valerie made a silent promise to herself. She would expose Arthur, not just for her own sake, but for Michael's. For everyone who had been wronged by the man she had once called her husband. The next morning, Valerie woke to an overwhelming stillness in the house. The usual hum of activity felt subdued, as though the mansion itself had fallen into a tense silence. She pushed back the heavy covers and stood by the window, watching the estate come to life in slow, deliberate motions. Workers moved about the grounds, but something about their demeanor seemed different, calculated. Watching her, Valerie's chest tightened. Arthur was aware of something. Even if he didn't know the full extent of her actions, she couldn't afford to misstep. After breakfast, Arthur appeared in the sitting room, his expression unreadable as he approached Valerie. He was dressed impeccably, his tie a precise Windsor knot, but his gaze carried a weight that unsettled her. "You've been keeping to yourself lately," Arthur remarked, sitting across from her. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Valerie replied, her voice calm but guarded. "Just taking some time to think." Arthur tilted his head, studying her. "You've been distant. If there's something on your mind, you can always talk to me." Valerie forced a smile. "Of course, I've just been tired, that's all." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You know you can trust me, don't you?" The words hung in the air, laced with an undertone Valerie couldn't ignore. She nodded, her smile unwavering despite the chill running down her spine. "Always." Arthur sat back, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. Good, because in this world, trust is everything. As Arthur left the room, Valerie's phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. "Found something. Can we meet today? I'll come to you. Let me know what time works." Valerie typed back quickly. "Afternoon works. I'll send you the address. Be careful." She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her mind racing. Emily's findings could be the breakthrough they needed, but meeting her posed a risk. Arthur's watchful presence was growing more suffocating by the hour. That afternoon, Valerie decided to test the waters. She wandered through the estate, stopping occasionally to greet the staff. Her interactions were brief, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. Arthur had people keeping an eye on her. She caught subtle glances, whispered exchanges, and even the deliberate pauses of workers who seemed to linger too long in her vicinity. By the time she reached the greenhouse, her unease had turned into frustration. Michael was inside, tending to a row of delicate orchids. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. "They're watching me," Valerie said bluntly, closing the door behind her. Michael nodded. "I noticed it too. A few of the groundskeepers aren't who they seem. Arthur must have brought them in recently. Do you think he knows what we're planning?" "Not yet," Michael replied. "But he's suspicious. We need to be careful." Valerie paced the small space, her mind racing. "Emily is coming this afternoon. She found something in the financials." Michael frowned. "That's risky, if Arthur's people see her coming here." "She's careful," Valerie interrupted. "She knows what's at stake." Michael didn't look convinced, but nodded. "Then we'll need a distraction, something to draw their attention away from the house." "What do you suggest?" Michael smirked faintly. "Leave that to me." When Emily arrived later that day, Michael's plan was already in motion. One of the estate's gardeners had accidentally triggered a sprinkler system in the west wing, causing a flurry of activity among the staff. The commotion gave Emily just enough time to slip into the mansion unnoticed. Valerie met her in the study, closing the door tightly behind them. Emily placed a folder on the desk, her expression grim. "I looked into the shell corporations," Emily began, flipping through the documents. "They're not just fronts for fraud. They're tied to offshore accounts that funnel money into entities connected to organized crime." Valerie's stomach churned. "Organized crime," Emily nodded. "And it gets worse. Some of the payments are marked as security services, but they're actually bribes to keep certain individuals quiet." "What kind of individuals?" Valerie asked, her voice trembling. Emily hesitated. "Witnesses, journalists, people who might have tried to expose Arthur." Valerie's hands gripped the edge of the desk. The magnitude of Arthur's deceit was almost too much to comprehend. "So, he's been silencing anyone who gets in his way?" "Yes," Emily confirmed. "And if these documents are legitimate, it's enough to launch a full-scale investigation." Valerie nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we need to act quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." As Emily left the study, Michael intercepted her near the side entrance. "You made it in without being seen?" he asked. "I think so," Emily replied, glancing over her shoulder. "But we need to move fast. Arthur's people are everywhere." Michael nodded. "I'll make sure she stays safe." Emily paused, studying him. "You care about her, don't you?" Michael didn't answer immediately. "She doesn't deserve any of this. None of us do." Emily gave him a small, understanding smile before slipping out into the fading daylight. That evening, Valerie sat by the window in her bedroom, watching the estate's lights flicker on one by one. The documents Emily had left sat on her desk, a damning collection of evidence that could destroy Arthur's empire. But the danger was growing. Arthur's web of control was tightening around her, and every move she made felt like walking a razor's edge. Michael's words echoed in her mind. We need to be careful. She knew he was right, but caution alone wouldn't save them. Action would. The following morning, the air around the estate felt heavy with tension. Valerie had barely slept, her mind consumed by the mounting risks. Arthur's calculated demeanor, the ever-watchful staff, and the damning evidence Emily had uncovered all painted a grim picture. She knew their window to act was shrinking. After a light breakfast, Valerie made her way to the study under the pretense of organizing paperwork. Once inside, she locked the door, pulled out her phone, and sent a message to Emily and Michael. We need to meet tonight, away from the house. Michael's reply came first. I'll arrange a location, somewhere safe. Emily followed moments later. Let me know where and when. I'll be there. As the day dragged on, Valerie went through the motions of her routine, all while feeling Arthur's presence lurking in the background. He was quieter than usual, his sharp eyes tracking her movements with unnerving precision. Every interaction felt like a test, every question a probe for information. That afternoon, as Valerie sat in the garden reading, Arthur approached with his trademark smile, a disarming facade that now only deepened her suspicion. You seem distracted, he remarked, sitting beside her. Is something on your mind? Valerie looked up, masking her unease with a soft laugh. Just tired, I suppose. I didn't sleep well. Arthur reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. If something's troubling you, you can tell me. You know that, don't you? Of course, Valerie replied, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. Arthur studied her for a moment longer before releasing her hand. Good. I wouldn't want anything coming between us. As he stood and walked away, Valerie exhaled shakily. His words felt less like reassurance and more like a warning. That evening, Michael sent Valerie a message with the meeting location, a small cafe on the outskirts of Greenwich, far enough from the estate to avoid suspicion. At precisely 8:30 p.m., Valerie slipped out of the house under the cover of darkness. Michael had arranged for a driver, one of the few people he trusted, to pick her up at a discreet side entrance. The car ride was tense, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Valerie clutched her handbag tightly, the weight of the documents inside reminding her of the stakes when they arrived at the cafe. Michael and Emily were already waiting in a secluded corner booth. Michael's face was set in a serious expression, while Emily looked as though she hadn't slept in days. Valerie slid into the booth, her voice hushed. Thank you for coming. Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the room. We don't have much time. What's our plan? Michael leaned forward, his tone low and deliberate. First, we need to ensure the documents are secure, Emily. Do you have a trusted contact who can analyze them further? Yes, Emily replied. I know someone who specializes in financial crimes. If we can get these to him, he'll know how to proceed. Good, Michael said. But we also need to think about our safety. Arthur's people are watching the house, and if he finds out what we're doing, he won't, Valerie interjected firmly. We'll stay ahead of him. The question is, how do we make this public without putting ourselves in danger? Emily hesitated. We'll need to time it perfectly. Once the evidence is verified, we can take it to the authorities, but we'll need to prepare for Arthur's retaliation. He won't go down quietly. Michael nodded. That's why we need to be careful about who we trust. Even the authorities can be compromised. Valerie's stomach churned at the thought. Then we need a backup plan, something that ensures this evidence sees the light of day, no matter what happens to us. The conversation stretched late into the night. Each detail carefully planned and debated. Emily would take the documents to her contact the next day, while Valerie and Michael would work to divert Arthur's attention. They decided to use Arthur's growing paranoia to their advantage, planting subtle distractions that would keep him preoccupied. By the time they left the cafe, the tension in the air was palpable. Valerie felt a flicker of hope amidst her fear, but it was fragile. One misstep and everything could crumble. As Valerie stepped out of the car and onto the estate's grounds, she felt the weight of Arthur's empire pressing down on her. The house stood in eerie silence, its grand facade now a stark reminder of the man she was preparing to dismantle. She slipped inside quietly, moving through the darkened halls with practiced ease. When she reached her bedroom, she locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. She thought of Michael, risking everything to protect her, of Emily, tirelessly working to untangle the web of Arthur's crimes, and of herself, a woman who had once believed in the facade of a perfect life, now standing on the precipice of its destruction. As she lay down, exhaustion finally taking hold, one thought echoed in her mind. This isn't over. Not yet. The following evening, the Bennett mansion was transformed into a spectacle of luxury and grandeur. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the opulent ballroom, their light reflecting off polished floors and gilded mirrors. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos filled the space, their laughter and conversation blending into a symphony of affluence. Valerie stood at the top of the grand staircase, her emerald green gown cascading elegantly around her. From afar, she looked every bit the composed and glamorous hostess, but inside, her nerves were fraying. Tonight wasn't just another social event, it was a performance, and the stakes were higher than ever. Arthur appeared beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. He wore a confident smile, the kind that charmed everyone in the room, but now only deepened Valerie's distrust. "You look stunning," he murmured, his voice smooth. "Thank you," she replied, forcing a smile. As they descended the staircase together, all eyes turned toward them. Arthur leaned in, his tone low but pointed. "Tonight is important, Valerie. I need you to be your best." "Of course," she replied, her voice steady, despite the knot tightening in her stomach. The evening unfolded like clockwork. Arthur moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with business magnates and influential figures. Valerie played her part, offering warm smiles and charming conversation, all while keeping her mind focused on the plan. Michael had assured her earlier that everything was in place. He had positioned himself among the catering staff, blending seamlessly into the background. His role tonight was critical, to monitor the movements of Arthur's people and ensure Valerie had the space she needed to act. As Valerie greeted a group of guests near the bar, she caught sight of Michael across the room. He gave her a subtle nod, a silent confirmation that all was proceeding as planned. Later in the evening, Arthur approached Valerie, a glass of champagne in hand. "Senator Clark is here," he said, gesturing toward an older man surrounded by a small group. "It's crucial that we make a good impression." Valerie followed his gaze, her heart sinking. Senator Clark was known for his connections to high-level investigations, a man whose favor Arthur clearly sought to secure. "Of course," Valerie replied, her voice calm. They made their way to the senator, Arthur slipping effortlessly into a conversation about business and politics. Valerie played her role perfectly, laughing at the right moments and offering thoughtful remarks. But her mind remained elsewhere, calculating the exact moment she could slip away unnoticed. As the night wore on, Valerie excused herself under the guise of freshening up. She moved through the ballroom with measured grace, careful not to draw attention. When she reached the hallway leading to Arthur's private office, her steps quickened. Michael was already there, standing guard near the door. "Everything's clear," he said in a low voice. Valerie nodded, her pulse quickening as she pushed open the door and slipped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city skyline visible through the windows. She moved quickly to the desk, pulling open the drawer where she had seen Arthur place a set of keys earlier that week. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, and she turned toward the locked filing cabinet in the corner. Michael had assured her this was where Arthur kept his most sensitive documents, files too incriminating to risk digitizing. The lock clicked open, and Valerie began rifling through the contents. Her breath caught as she pulled out folders filled with contracts, bank statements, and handwritten notes. It was all there: proof of bribes, offshore accounts, and connections to organized crime. As she worked, a faint noise outside the door made her freeze. Voices, low and muffled but approaching. She glanced at Michael, who was already moving to intercept. Stepping out into the hallway, Michael came face to face with two of Arthur's men. They regarded him suspiciously, their eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" one of them asked. "Cleaning up," Michael replied smoothly. Holding up a tray of empty glasses he had taken from the kitchen, the men exchanged a glance before one of them muttered, Stay out of the private areas. Michael nodded, his expression calm as they walked away. Once they were out of sight, he slipped back into the office. "We need to move," he whispered. "Now," Valerie nodded, carefully gathering the documents into her bag as they exited the office. Her heart pounded in her chest. The risk they were taking was monumental, but the evidence in her possession could finally bring Arthur down. Back in the ballroom, the gala continued in full swing. Valerie rejoined the crowd, slipping effortlessly back into her role as hostess. Across the room, she caught sight of Arthur laughing with a group of executives, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath his feet. Michael returned to his post among the staff, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. As Valerie moved through the crowd, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The documents in her bag were more than just paper. They were a lifeline, a chance to escape the shadow of Arthur's control. But as the night drew to a close, she couldn't shake the feeling that the game they were playing was far from over. The morning after the gala, the Bennett mansion was unusually quiet. Valerie sat in her bedroom. The documents she had stolen from Arthur's office spread out across the bed. Each page was another piece of the puzzle, a damning testament to the man her husband truly was. Offshore accounts, shell companies, forged contracts. It was all there. She ran her fingers over one of the files, her stomach twisting. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her chest. Exposing, Arthur wasn't just a risk to her safety. It would dismantle everything she had built with him, every facade she had maintained for years. But there was no turning back now. Emily arrived at the estate that afternoon, her demeanor tense but focused. She carried a briefcase filled with additional evidence she and her contact had uncovered: banking records, emails, and even audio recordings implicating Arthur in bribery and conspiracy. "We have enough to take him down," Emily said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But we need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more time he has to cover his tracks." Valerie nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she packed the documents into a larger folder. "Tonight," she said firmly. "We'll confront him tonight." Michael, standing near the door, crossed his arms. "Are you sure about this? Arthur's not the type to go down without a fight." "I know," Valerie replied, meeting his gaze. "But this is the only way. If we do this publicly, he won't have a chance to silence us." That evening, Arthur hosted a smaller gathering at the mansion, a private dinner for a select group of investors and political allies. Valerie had initially resisted attending, but now she saw it as an opportunity. The dining room was lavishly set, the long table adorned with silver candlesticks and fine china. Guests chatted amiably, their laughter filling the space as Arthur worked the room with his usual charm. Valerie sat quietly at the far end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could feel the weight of the folder hidden beneath the dining chair, its contents burning like a brand against her skin. As dessert was served, Arthur raised his glass, commanding the attention of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and confident, "I want to thank you all for your unwavering support. Together, we've accomplished remarkable things, and the future looks brighter than ever." The room erupted into applause, but Valerie barely heard it. Her pulse quickened as she stood, the movement drawing the attention of the guests. "Arthur," she said, her voice steady but loud enough to cut through the noise. He turned to her, his expression briefly flickering with surprise before settling into a composed smile. "Yes, my dear." Valerie took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "There's something everyone here needs to know." The room fell silent as Valerie stepped forward, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the anticipation crackling like static in the air. "Arthur has built an empire on lies," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "For years, he's been using fraudulent companies to funnel money into offshore accounts, bribing officials, and silencing anyone who stood in his way." Gasps erupted around the table, and Arthur's smile froze, his eyes narrowing. "Valerie," he said, his tone low and dangerous, "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't the time or place for such baseless accusations." "They're not baseless," Valerie shot back, holding up the folder. "I have the proof. Every transaction, every bribe, it's all here." Arthur's composure cracked. his expression darkening as he stepped toward her. "Enough," he growled. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Valerie countered, her voice rising. "You were planning to use the Chicago trip to get rid of me, weren't you? To tie up a loose end in your perfect plan?" The room erupted into murmurs as the guests exchanged shocked glances. Before Arthur could respond, Michael stepped into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. He held a USB drive aloft. "This contains recordings of Arthur's conversations," Michael announced, including one where he explicitly discusses his plans to eliminate Valerie. Arthur turned to Michael, his eyes blazing with fury. "You," he spat. "I should have fired you months ago." "You should have," Michael replied coolly, "but you didn't, and now it's too late." At that moment, Emily entered the room, flanked by two plainclothes officers. The guests parted as the officers stepped forward, their expressions grim. "Arthur Bennett," one of them said, "you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder." Arthur's face twisted in rage as the officers moved to cuff him. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this, all of you." Valerie stood her ground, her chin held high as she watched him being led away. The weight she had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a profound sense of relief. As the guests began to disperse, murmuring in hushed tones, Valerie turned to Michael and Emily. "It's done," she said quietly, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and triumph. Emily placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were brave tonight, Valerie. Not many people could have done what you just did." Michael nodded, his gaze steady. "Arthur's empire will crumble, but more importantly, you're free now." Valerie smiled faintly, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you, both of you. I couldn't have done this without you." The morning after Arthur's dramatic arrest, the Bennett mansion was unusually quiet, its grandeur dimmed by the weight of the previous evening's revelations. Valerie sat in the living room, staring at the empty space where Arthur's presence had once loomed large. The air felt lighter without him, but a strange unease gnawed at her. Michael entered the room, his expression tense. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice low. Valerie looked up, her heart sinking at the tone of his voice. "What is it?" Michael hesitated, then handed her his phone. On the screen was a news alert. "Arthur Bennett escapes custody during transfer." Valerie's breath caught in her throat as she read the headline. "How?" she whispered. "Apparently, someone helped him," Michael replied grimly. "The transport vehicle was intercepted. No one's saying who was behind it, but we both know Arthur has powerful connections." The room seemed to tilt as Valerie processed the news. Arthur wasn't just dangerous. He was a man who thrived on control. And now he was loose again. The hours that followed were a blur of phone calls and strategy sessions. Emily arrived at the mansion, her briefcase in hand, and her demeanor sharper than ever. "This doesn't change the evidence we have," Emily said firmly. "Arthur's escape only makes him look guiltier. The authorities are on high alert, and we've ensured that the documents are in safe hands. But it changes everything for us," Michael countered. "Arthur's not the type to run and hide. He'll come back for Valerie. Or for revenge." Valerie swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the armrest of the sofa. "We need to assume the worst," she said. "If he's coming for me, I have to be ready." That night, the mansion was fortified. Michael and a trusted security team patrolled the grounds, while Emily coordinated with law enforcement to track Arthur's movements. Valerie retreated to her bedroom, her nerves frayed but her resolve unshaken. As she sat by the window, staring out at the darkened estate, memories of the past few weeks flooded her mind. The lies, the betrayals, and the moments of courage that had brought her to this point. It all felt surreal. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise outside. At first, she dismissed it as the wind rustling the trees. But then she heard it again. Footsteps on the gravel driveway. Her pulse quickened as she reached for her phone, dialing Michael. "Michael," she whispered. "There's someone outside." "I'm on it," he replied immediately. "Stay in your room and lock the door." Michael moved swiftly through the mansion, his instincts on high alert. He reached the front door and motioned for 2 guards to follow him as they stepped outside. The cool night air was thick with tension as they scanned the grounds. Near the guest house, a shadow shifted. Michael raised his hand, signaling for silence as they crept closer. "Arthur," Michael called out, his voice firm. "If you're here, it's over. Don't make this worse." There was no response, only the faint rustle of leaves. Michael motioned for the guards to fan out, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Suddenly, a figure darted out from behind a tree. Sprinting toward the main house, Michael reacted instantly, chasing after him. Valerie heard the commotion from her bedroom. She pressed her ear to the door, her heart pounding as shouts echoed through the halls. She wanted to stay put, as Michael had instructed, but the thought of Arthur so close spurred her into action. She grabbed the small safe key hidden in her nightstand and opened a concealed drawer. Inside was a pepper spray canister and a small, discreet panic alarm. Clutching them tightly, she stepped into the hallway. In the main foyer, Michael and one of the guards managed to corner Arthur. His once polished appearance was disheveled, his suit wrinkled and stained, but his eyes burned with the same cold determination that Valerie had come to know so well. "You've lost, Arthur," Michael said, his voice steady. "There's nowhere left to run." Arthur's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "You think you've won?" Valerie appeared at the top of the staircase, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "It is over, Arthur. You don't have control anymore." Arthur's gaze snapped to her, his expression twisting into a mix of rage and desperation. "You betrayed me," he hissed. "After everything I built for us, you threw it all away. You built a house of lies," Valerie replied, her voice firm. "And it's crumbling whether you like it or not." Arthur lunged toward the staircase, but Michael intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. The guards quickly moved in, restraining him as he thrashed and shouted. Valerie descended the stairs slowly, her hands trembling as she approached. She stopped a few feet away, meeting Arthur's glare with steady resolve. "You're done, Arthur," she said softly but firmly. "You don't control me anymore, and you never will again." As the guards hauled Arthur to his feet, he spat one final threat. "This isn't the end. I'll make you pay for this." Valerie stood her ground, watching as he was dragged out of the mansion and into the waiting arms of the authorities. The adrenaline finally began to fade as the door closed behind them. Michael turned to Valerie, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. Valerie nodded slowly, though her hands still trembled. "I am now. Thank you, Michael." Emily appeared moments later, her phone in hand. "Arthur's back in custody," she said. "This time, they'll make sure he doesn't get out." Valerie exhaled deeply, a weight lifting from her chest. "It's over," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "It's finally over." The next morning dawned with a crisp, clear sky, but the atmosphere inside the Bennett mansion was heavy with the aftermath of Arthur's recapture. Valerie sat at the breakfast table, her tea untouched, her mind racing. The events of the previous night played in an endless loop, each moment seared into her memory. Michael entered the room, his expression weary but resolute. "The authorities confirmed he's in maximum security now," he said, breaking the silence. "They're taking no chances this time." Valerie nodded, her grip tightening around her teacup. "It's strange," she said softly. "I should feel relieved, but instead I just feel empty." "That's normal," Michael replied, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. "You've spent so much of your life tied to him, his lies, his control. It's going to take time to process everything." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you, Michael, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Michael gave her a faint smile. "You didn't just do this. You led the charge. You're stronger than you think." Later that morning, Emily arrived, her usual professional demeanor softened by a look of concern. She carried a folder under her arm, setting it down on the table as she joined Valerie and Michael in the study. "I've been working with the authorities," Emily began. "The evidence we provided has been instrumental. Arthur's facing charges on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. There's enough to ensure he won't see the outside of a prison cell for decades." Valerie exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. "It's finally over," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Not entirely," Emily cautioned. "There's still the fallout to consider. His associates, his investors, they'll be scrambling to cover their tracks. Some of them may try to come after you." Michael straightened in his chair, They'll have to get through me first. Valerie smiled faintly, her confidence bolstered by their unwavering support. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. Whatever comes next, I'll face it head on. Over the next few days, news of Arthur's arrest spread like wildfire. The once revered businessman was now the center of a national scandal. His face plastered across every major news outlet. Headlines detailed his crimes, painting a vivid picture of the man who had deceived so many for so long. Valerie found herself at the center of the media frenzy. Reporters camped outside the estate, their cameras trained on the gates in hopes of catching a glimpse of her. She avoided them as best she could, focusing instead on rebuilding her life. One afternoon, as she walked through the gardens, Valerie found Michael tending to a row of rose bushes. He looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on a cloth. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Better," she replied, sitting on the edge of a stone bench. "It's strange, though. For so long, I lived in this bubble of illusion, believing Arthur was someone he wasn't. Now that the truth is out, I feel like I'm rediscovering who I am." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've been through a lot, but you're stronger for it. And you're not alone," she smiled, the warmth of his words seeping into her heart. "Thank you, Michael. You've been my anchor through all of this." That evening, Valerie sat in the study, reviewing the final pieces of evidence Emily had submitted to the authorities. As she flipped through the files, her phone buzzed. It was Emily. "Valerie," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "There's one more thing you should know." "What is it?" Valerie asked, her stomach tightening. "We've uncovered more about Arthur's dealings. Some of his associates are still active, and they've been linked to other criminal networks. The authorities are handling it, but you need to stay vigilant." Valerie's jaw tightened. "I won't let them intimidate me," she said. "Arthur may have been the mastermind, but he's not invincible. None of them are." "Good," Emily replied. "You've already shown incredible courage. Just remember, we're in this together." As the days turned into weeks, the frenzy surrounding Arthur's case began to settle. Valerie started making plans to transform the mansion, turning it from a symbol of deceit into one of hope. She called a meeting with her staff, explaining her vision. "This house has been the center of so much pain," she said, "but I want to change that. From now on, it will be a place of refuge, a safe haven for those in need." The staff listened intently, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. Michael stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed and a faint smile on his face. That evening, as the sun set over the estate, Valerie stood on the balcony of her bedroom, gazing out at the sprawling grounds. The weight of her past still lingered, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Michael joined her, his presence a steady comfort. "You're really doing it," he said, leaning against the railing. "It's the least I can do," Valerie replied. "For everyone Arthur hurt, and for myself, this is my way of making amends." Michael nodded. "You've come a long way, Valerie, and I'll be here, every step of the way." She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Michael, thank you." The two stood in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them as the stars began to emerge. For the first time in a long time, Valerie felt free. The weeks following Arthur's arrest brought a mix of chaos and clarity to Valerie's life, while the media frenzy gradually died down. The echoes of his actions lingered, affecting everyone who had been entangled in his schemes. Valerie, however, remained steadfast in her mission to rebuild not just her life, but the very foundation of the Bennett estate. One crisp morning, Valerie stood in the middle of the grand foyer, surrounded by movers and contractors. The once ornate space, filled with Arthur's carefully curated symbols of power, was now being dismantled. Chandeliers, paintings, and antique furniture were packed away, replaced by plans for something simpler, more welcoming. "Everything's coming down," she instructed a contractor, her voice firm but calm. "This house needs a new identity." Michael appeared by her side, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You're really doing it," he said with a faint smile. Valerie glanced at him, a spark of determination in her eyes. This place was a monument to Arthur's lies. "I want it to be something more, a refuge for those who need it, not a showcase of wealth," Michael nodded. It's a noble goal and fitting, considering everything you've been through. As the renovations began, Valerie threw herself into the project. Her days filled with meetings, designs, and decisions. She wanted every detail to reflect her vision, a place that stood for hope and renewal. Emily stopped by one afternoon, her briefcase replaced by a bouquet of fresh flowers. "I heard about the renovations," she said, handing Valerie the flowers with a warm smile. "I thought these might brighten the place up." "Thank you, Emily," Valerie replied, setting the bouquet on the newly refinished table. "You've done so much for me already. I don't know how to repay you." Emily shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. Seeing you take back control of your life is reward enough." They sat together in the sunlit sitting room, sipping tea and discussing the latest updates on Arthur's case. "The prosecution is airtight," Emily assured her. "Arthur's not getting out of this one. I'm not worried about him anymore," Valerie admitted, her tone softer than Emily expected. "I've realized that holding on to fear only gives him more power. I'm done with that." As the mansion transformed, so did Valerie, the once carefully composed woman, who had hidden behind polished smiles and designer dresses, now embraced a simpler, more authentic version of herself. She spent her mornings walking through the gardens, often stopping to chat with Michael as he worked. Their conversations grew deeper, the barriers between them dissolving with each passing day. One afternoon, as they stood by the newly planted rose bushes, Michael spoke up. "You know, this place is going to mean something to a lot of people. You're giving them a chance to heal." Valerie smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's healing me too. I never realized how much I needed to rebuild. Not just this house, but myself." Michael hesitated, then said, "You've been through so much, but you never gave up. That kind of strength is rare." She looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I wouldn't have made it without you, Michael. You've been my rock through all of this." The day the renovations were completed, Valerie hosted a small gathering to celebrate. The mansion, once a cold and imposing structure, now radiated warmth and light. Soft colors replaced the dark, heavy tones, and the grand spaces were reimagined into inviting rooms filled with natural light. Among the guests were Emily, members of the staff who had remained loyal, and a few representatives from local organizations Valerie planned to partner with for her new mission. As she stood before them to give a speech, she felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. "This house has been many things over the years," she began, her voice steady. "But for too long, it was a symbol of power built on deception. Today, that changes. From now on, this will be a place of refuge, a home for those who need one, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, there's always hope." The room erupted into applause, but Valerie's gaze settled on Michael, standing near the back. He gave her a small nod, his eyes filled with pride. Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed, Valerie and Michael stood on the balcony overlooking the estate. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of the newly bloomed flowers in the garden below. "You did it," Michael said, leaning against the railing. "You turned this place into something incredible." Valerie smiled, her eyes scanning the grounds. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." Michael chuckled softly. "You give me too much credit. This was your vision, your strength." She turned to him, her expression earnest. "But you were the one who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. That means everything." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their journey hanging in the air. Then, Valerie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael, what happens now, with all of this?" He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Now, you live. You build a new life, free of everything that held you back. And if you need me, I'll be here." Valerie felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Valerie and Michael stood together, looking out at the future they had fought so hard to create. The days following the grand reopening of the mansion were marked by a quiet but steady transformation in Valerie's life. The estate, once cloaked in secrecy and pretense, now buzzed with purpose. Volunteers from local organizations began arriving, helping to establish the programs Valerie envisioned. A safe space for those in need, offering resources and support to rebuild lives. Each day brought new challenges, but Valerie faced them head-on, her determination unwavering. She had spent too long hiding behind the facade of perfection. Now, she was ready to embrace authenticity, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. One morning, as Valerie walked through the gardens, she noticed Emily waiting by the fountain, her usual polished demeanor replaced with a rare softness. Valerie approached, a curious smile playing on her lips. "Emily," Valerie greeted. "I didn't know you were stopping by today." "I thought I'd surprise you," Emily replied, holding up a folder. "I have some updates on Arthur's case." Valerie's smile faltered, but she nodded, gesturing for Emily to sit on a nearby bench. "The prosecution is moving forward," Emily began, flipping through the papers. "With the evidence we've provided, Arthur's defense doesn't stand a chance. The trial will be quick." Valerie exhaled slowly. "That's good. The sooner it's over, the better." Emily hesitated, her gaze lingering on Valerie. "How are you holding up, really?" Valerie looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the bench. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel free once Arthur was out of my life, and in many ways I do. But there's still this weight. The damage he caused doesn't just disappear overnight." Emily reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Valerie's. "Healing takes time, Valerie. You've come so far already. Don't forget to give yourself credit for that." Valerie smiled faintly. "Thanks, Emily, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Later that day, Valerie met Michael by the greenhouse. He was repairing one of the irrigation lines. His shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands covered in dirt. He looked up as she approached, a smile breaking across his face. "Hard at work, I see," Valerie teased. "Always," Michael replied, wiping his hands on a cloth. "What brings you out here?" "I wanted to talk," Valerie said, her tone more serious. Michael straightened, his expression attentive. "What's on your mind?" Valerie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about trust, how easy it is to lose, and how hard it is to rebuild." Michael nodded slowly. "It's not easy, especially after everything you've been through. You've been one of the few constants in all of this," Valerie continued, her voice soft. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and that's something I'll never take for granted." Michael looked at her, his gaze steady. "You've earned that trust, Valerie, and if you ever doubt yourself, just remember how far you've come. You're stronger than you know." That evening, Valerie sat in her study, poring over plans for the estate's new programs. She had decided to focus on initiatives that supported women in rebuilding their lives, offering counseling, job training, and a safe space to start over. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emily. "I've connected you with a foundation that can provide additional funding. They're excited to partner with you." Valerie smiled, feeling a surge of hope. For the first time in years, she felt like she was making a real difference, not just for herself, but for others. As the night deepened, Valerie wandered to the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. She gazed out at the estate, the soft glow of the newly installed lights illuminating the gardens below. Michael joined her a few moments later, a cup of tea in his hand. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, offering her the cup. "Not yet," Valerie admitted, taking the tea with a grateful smile. "There's too much on my mind." Michael leaned against the railing, his gaze thoughtful. "You've turned this place into something incredible, Valerie. It's not just a house anymore. It's a home for so many people who need one." Valerie looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Michael. You've been my anchor through all of this." He chuckled softly. "I think you give me too much credit." "No," Valerie said firmly, her voice steady. "You've been my partner in this, in every sense of the word, and I want you to know how much that means to me." Michael's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of everything they had endured seemed to fade as the stars began to dot the night sky. Valerie felt a sense of peace settling over her. The mansion was no longer a prison of lies and deceit. It was a symbol of resilience, hope, and new beginnings, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever the future held. The dawn broke softly over the Bennett estate, casting warm hues of gold and pink across the sky. Valerie stood by her bedroom window, the sunlight spilling onto her face. For the first time in years, she felt truly present, as though the weight of her past no longer loomed over her. The mansion, once a hollow monument to Arthur's deceit, now pulsed with life and purpose. The halls echoed with laughter and conversation, the sounds of hope replacing the silence that had once suffocated them. Valerie spent her morning walking through the newly renovated East Wing, where the first group of women had begun settling into their rooms. She stopped to greet a young mother with her toddler, their smiles bright, despite the hardships they had endured. "Thank you for giving us a chance," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. Valerie placed a hand on her shoulder, her own eyes glistening. "You don't have to thank me. This is your home now." Later that day, Valerie met Emily and Michael in the study. Emily had brought a final update on Arthur's case, her demeanor calm but triumphant. "The trial is set," Emily announced, placing a stack of papers on the desk. "With the evidence we've submitted, the prosecution is confident they'll secure a conviction. Arthur won't be able to manipulate his way out of this one." Valerie nodded, her expression steady. "Good. It's time he answers for everything he's done." Michael leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "What about his associates? Are they being investigated too?" Emily smiled faintly. "The authorities are working on it. Arthur's arrest has already exposed several key players, and they're unraveling the rest of the network. It's only a matter of time." Valerie exhaled, a sense of closure settling over her. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I would have done without you." Emily shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Valerie. You've done the hard part, taking back control of your life." That evening, Valerie and Michael sat on the steps of the mansion's front porch, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. "You've built something incredible here," Michael said, breaking the comfortable silence. "It doesn't feel real sometimes," Valerie admitted. "For so long I lived in a world of lies. Now it's like I'm finally waking up." Michael nodded. "You deserve this, Valerie. After everything you've been through, you've earned the right to start over." She looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "And what about you, Michael? What happens now?" Michael hesitated, then said, "I'll stay as long as you need me. This place, this mission. It means something to me too." Valerie's smile deepened, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm glad. I don't think I could do this without you." As the weeks turned into months, the mansion's transformation became a symbol of resilience for the community. Valerie worked tirelessly to expand the programs, partnering with local organizations and reaching out to donors who shared her vision. Michael remained by her side, his quiet strength a constant source of support. Together, they navigated the challenges that came with building something new, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as they walked through the gardens, Michael stopped suddenly, turning to Valerie. "You've changed so much," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "The woman you've become. It's inspiring." Valerie met his gaze, her heart full. "I've had good people by my side, you, Emily. I couldn't have done any of this alone." Michael smiled, his eyes softening. "You're stronger than you think, Valerie. Don't forget that." The day the first group of women graduated from the estate's programs was a milestone Valerie would never forget. She stood on the newly built stage in the courtyard, addressing the gathered crowd. "Today, we celebrate not just new beginnings, but the strength and courage it takes to start over," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This house was once a place of lies and control. Now, it stands as a testament to hope, resilience, and the power of community." The audience erupted into applause, and Valerie felt a swell of pride. She looked out at the faces before her, women who had endured so much yet emerged stronger, children who now had a safe place to call home, and the team that had made it all possible. Among them was Michael, standing near the back, his arms crossed and a faint smile on his face. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Valerie felt a profound sense of peace as the celebration wound down. Valerie and Michael stood together near the edge of the garden, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the estate. "What's next for you?" Michael asked, his tone light but curious. Valerie took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the grounds. "I don't know," she admitted, "but for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of the unknown." Michael smiled. "That's a good place to start." Valerie turned to him, her expression soft. "And you? Will you stay?" Michael hesitated, then nodded. "As long as you'll have me." She smiled, her heart full. "Then let's see where this journey takes us." That night, as Valerie stood on the balcony of her bedroom, looking out at the estate, she felt a deep sense of contentment. The mansion was no longer a symbol of her past. It was a beacon of hope for the future. And with Michael by her side, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them.